So today we're going to look at VUM, which stands for vSphere Update Manager. Okay, so it's a bit similar to the WSUS. Okay, so if you remember, WSUS was all about updating, delivering the updates. Let me see if I've got this on the right screen. No, swap screen. All right. So if you remember, WSUS was all about downloading the updates and then applying those updates to your LAN computers. Okay, and obviously, if we're talking about LAN computers, there's a whole huge number of those LAN computers. So instead of downloading it several thousands of times, you can download it once. Okay, same idea in the sense that we might not have thousands of LAN computers as far as the virtual machines and virtual machine hosts and stuff like that, but we should still have a larger number of them. Okay, not thousands, maybe like tens. Okay, tens to up to 100 maybe in our, depending on how big the scenario is, of course. So the whole aim of this VUM is to download it to one centralized computer, and that VUM is going to be our vCenter, and that VUM is part of the lifecycle management manager for vSphere. So what does that mean? So with VUM, it's update manager, but we can also update the whole installation, whole version. So obviously we know that we can update just little patches and stuff like that. And that's what we're going to do in our worksheet, which is just do patches. But we can also take this VUM and actually deliver whole upgrades. So if you remember, we talked about in the previous subject, we talked about embedded ESXi. So if you remember, that means that instead of actually having local hard disk we can have local hard disk, we can have those without local hard disk, but we can actually deploy a new image to these ESXis based on an upgraded version of ESXi. So right now we're using 7.03, I believe, of vSphere and VMware ESXi and vCenter. Obviously, there's at this stage, at this point in time right now, there's a version 8 as well. So instead of actually going to each one of our ESXi servers and manually upgrading to version 8, we can actually use the VUM to deploy the whole new upgraded version or updated version of it, not just the little patches. Okay, so today's objective is to install VUM and integrate it into our sorry, it's already installed, but we're going to integrate it into our environment. To do that, it's going to be a little bit funny. Okay, Roman? So to do that, it's going to be a little bit funny because of the fact that where are the updates? Are they on our LAN or are they on the internet? So the updates we need to get. On the internet, that's right. But if you notice that all our virtual machines in our labs are host only, aren't we? All right, and in reality, there's no such thing as just host-only computers because every LAN has internet connection, has gateway, right? So that's pretty normal, isn't it? But in our labs, it's not normal. In our lab, it's host-only, and we can actually obviously make a change to NAT or to bridge, but that's going to mess things up. So the weird thing we're going to do today, so if you remember in your Cert 4 networking, we actually installed routing and remote access service. Okay, so if you remember, we did that for VPN purposes, but today we're not going to do that. We're going to be very simple. So we don't have many servers. We don't want to mess with the Horizon server because that's obviously the thing we want to learn, but we do have the domain controller. Okay, so basically what I'm saying to you, Roman, is it is weird to have a domain controller that's also a routing and remote access service. Okay, that's definitely 100% weird. That's not what we would do normally. But to make it easier for our lab environment only because it's a lab environment, not because it's a production, okay? Yeah. That we are going to put the routing and remote access service onto the domain controller because that makes it less secure, doesn't it? Because it's giving you access to somewhere else, to the internet possibly. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a NAT interface to the domain controller. So it's going to have two, one host only, one NAT. And then we are going to install the routing and remote access service, which is RAS, if you remember. And we're going to configure it to be NAT. So configure our domain controller to be a NAT server. Okay, a bit like your router at home. So what is going to happen is that all the computers which are on our lab are going to use so today we only configure a couple of computers because we don't really need the ESXi host to use the NAT. What we're going to do is we're going to configure the Horizon server to have a gateway, and that gateway is going to be the internal interface of the domain controller, which is the 192.168.20.2. Again, that's not the IP address normally for gateway, and we're going to also configure the vSphere, vCenter, to use that as a gateway as well. So now, do you understand that we're going to go through the gateway to the internet and download all the patches and updates to the vCenter for the VUM, and then the VUM is going to store it. We're going to create what's called baselines, which basically talks about what products we want to update, which priority, like as in is it critical, is it severity, is it like security patches, or is it like just feature patches and those kind of things. We're going to choose those kind of things, and then we are going to attach those baselines to the ESXi host, and then we're going to scan to see if they're compliant. So obviously compliant means you have all the patches. Non-compliant means you don't have all the patches, right? Or you don't have some of the patches. So we're going to, with these baseline groups, we're going to make it so that they're the very latest patches. So not like you can create baselines which are just a set list of patches if you wanted to, but we're going to make it so that it's not just a set list. It's dynamic, meaning it's constantly going to check for newer patches that fits the criteria. And then we're going to do a scan for compliance, and if we'll see that the ESXi host will be not compliant, we'll be missing lots of patches, because obviously what did we do? We just installed it, didn't we? From original ISO. And that ISO is a little bit old now, but we wanted to keep the same ISO because we didn't want to have different versions and different look, different feature, different functionality potentially. So because we're doing it as a lab, I want to make sure that my notes today will work for the same students next semester because of keeping the same version. Okay, so that's the reason why it's going to be like that. All right, so, and then we're going to do an update, which will mean that it'll go, it's called remediation. So the update is called remediation. Remediation really means fixing, okay? So it's going to remediate those servers, and to do that, the servers, if they have virtual machines on them, they either have to be turned off or they have to be migrated to another host, okay? And that's the beauty of virtualization, is that if we have to do that maintenance, we can use live migration or vMotion to migrate to another host. And then we enter what's called a maintenance mode on the host. Maintenance mode, okay? It's a mode where it's on, but it's not on for virtualization. It's on for doing maintenance. And then it's going to remediate it, which means apply the patches. You'll probably have to do a restart, or sometimes it might be needing to do a couple of restarts depending on what patches we apply. And then when it comes finish, it'll exit maintenance mode, which means stop that maintenance mode, and then it becomes an ESXi host again, and the virtual machines can be migrated back, and then the other one can be do the maintenance or remediation. Okay, so that's the aim today in the lab. So today's objective is to determine which hosts or VMs need to be patched or upgraded. Use VUM to upgrade. We can upgrade VMware hardware as well, virtual hardware and VMware tools on the virtual machines, but that's not that important for us. The most important thing for us today is the patching of the ESXi, because the virtual machines we're talking about are non-persistent instant clones, aren't they? So we don't need to patch them. If we want to patch them, we will patch the golden master periodically, okay? Because they're discarded as soon as they're used. So we'll upgrade. We'll apply patches to the host, and that's probably that's what we'll be doing. But we can also upgrade the host and coordinate large-scale data center upgrades, which means instead of actually doing one at a time, so instead of doing it all at once, maybe we can stagger it, because we've got certain amount of virtual machines we need to keep on, right? That's the whole thing about uptime and availability. So we can't upgrade all at the same time. So maybe we'll be doing what's called a rolling upgrade, which means that some of them will be taken offline, upgraded, then put back online, and virtual machines migrated to those, and others will then go into taken offline, upgraded, and so forth. So rolling upgrade. We can also look at what could we do to the hosts if we don't have one. Okay, so in some circumstances, what if you just had ESXi by itself? You could still need upgrades, right? So today we're going to look at so VUM, vSphere Update Manager, automates and streamlines the updates. It's integrated as part of the vCenter server, so we already use the vCenter, and it's part of the lifecycle manager. So when we're talking about lifecycle manager, it's the lifecycle of the host. Okay, can update and deploy new versions of the host. So like, for example, complete new versions like 7.0 to 8 point something. It can scan and remediate ESXi hosts, host extensions, and older ESX. So that's really old now. That's really, really old. So we probably won't see too much of those. And ESXi host and virtual appliances. It can also be used to upgrade the VMware tools on the virtual machines itself, and can also upgrade the virtual hardware definitions. Okay, so don't forget, this is not what we use to upgrade what's inside of the virtual machine. What's inside of the virtual machine is the operating system, isn't it? The Windows operating system or Linux operating system, and they have their own update methods. What VUM is there to do is to upgrade the virtualization infrastructure and all the components of the virtual machine, such as the virtual hardware and the VMware tools. You get me, Roman? Okay, so you would not, if you had vSphere as your virtualization infrastructure, and you had virtualization of servers as well as workstations, you would definitely still have VUM, and you still definitely have WSUS. So they work together. VUM can also install and update the Cisco Nexus 1000V switch and any other third-party distributed virtual switches. If you remember, we talked about how we can create our own switches, virtual switches in vSphere, right? And we can create distributed switches or standard switches. But we can also get third-party virtual switches, such as the Cisco Nexus 1000V. What does that mean? That means if you look at the Cisco switches, Cisco products, and you know that Cisco got iOS, and it's got a sort of integrated operating system, and it's got functionality like quality of service, VLANs, and all those kind of things, right? What if you want those same features in the virtual switches? There's no point having quality of service on the Cisco switches in the physical world if you don't have quality of service in the virtual switches, for example, right? Because that's maybe where the service is being hosted is in the virtual environment. So by having these third-party switches like Cisco Nexus 1000V, those same features that's in the physical switches can be in the virtual switches as well. And this can be used, VUM can be used to update those. VUM can use DRS. If you remember, that's Distributed Resource Scheduler. So that's where it automatically balances resource utilization between the hosts for non-disruptive updating of ESXi hosts. What does that mean? Basically, if I had to turn off the virtual machines in order to update the ESXi host, that's a disruption, isn't it? Okay. So what it's saying is it can use DRS to say that this server, this ESXi host, is going to go offline, and use DRS. If you remember, Distributed Resource Scheduler uses a vMotion to migrate virtual machines from one host to another host without downtime. So basically, it will find the right other hosts that are capable of hosting these VMs and migrates it to those while balancing wherever hosts are still on. And then can be this ESXi host, which has no more virtual machines on it anymore, can be then remediated. It can coordinate with clusters distributed power management. That's again to do with DRS. Remember, distributed power management is a way of actually turning off virtual machines at a certain turning off hosts at a certain time in the day, because you know that the utilization is going to be lower because everyone's asleep, for example, and then turning them on at other points in the day because you know that people are waking up and now needing to use your service. It can also coordinate with high availability. So high availability is where, obviously, if a virtual machine fails or the host fails, the virtual machine can be restarted on another host. So obviously, by moving those virtual machines from one host to another host, you need to make sure that there is still availability or resource availability to be able to restart that virtual machine on a separate host if required. And also fault tolerance. If you remember, fault tolerance is where we have a virtual machine and a sort of mirror copy of that virtual machine, which is not active. And anything that happens on one happens on the other, maintaining a perfect with redundancy. But remember, if you remember when we did the previous visualization subject, the fault tolerance is not great for every situation. It almost needs to be identical hardware that it's running on, and they can't have many features of it enabled. For example, you can't have non-persistent disks. You can't have any physical mounting of physical hardware, for example. Okay. So basically, you can coordinate with those so that they don't prevent VUM from updating. Okay. So that means it coordinates with those things so that when an ESXi needs to be updated or patched, that they are capable of using all those features to migrate virtual machines off while still providing high availability or fault tolerance and allow the ESXi to update. VUM can calculate if it can remediate multiple hosts at the same time while still appeasing the cluster constraints. What does that mean? It means that, like, what if we have 10 ESXis? Obviously, in our lab, we only have 2. It's pretty obvious, right? But if we had 10, maybe we could update 2. Or maybe we can do 3. But it calculates how many can we do at the same time. So it migrates as many of the virtual machines off those ones that we can can remediate, so that they can be freed up to be remediated. The whole VUM experience is fully synthesized with the vCenter, as in it's part of vCenter, and allowing the configuration and remediation to be all done from the vCenter web client. Okay. VUM uses 2 views. There's an administrative view where you can configure the VUM settings and manage the baselines, and we'll see that in our worksheet. There's also a compliance view where we can go to each host and see if they're compliant and scan for the compliancy. So it's basically, we got this is what you baseline is. This is what you should have. Yeah. And compliance is do you have it? If you don't have it, you're non-compliant. If you do have it, you are compliant. Yeah. So it scans what if you're compliant or not. It shows you what needs to be done, like how many critical updates, how many severe updates, how many whatever updates you need. And then you can actually then remediate. Remediate is a word for fixing. So fixing it. So when applying updates to VMs, VUM can apply snapshot. Sorry, are we? Yeah. When applying updates to VMs, so if it's a VM that we're updating, which we won't be doing today, we can actually apply a snapshot to them just in case. If the virtual machine during an update experiences some problems, we can just roll back one step and pretend that never ever happened. It can identify when hardware upgrades and VMware tools, virtual hardware upgrades that is, and VMware tools are needed to combine into a single task. Okay. All right. vSphere Update Manager or VUM utilizes your internet connection to download and update the information. So it's always live information. It's like in the classroom, we like to keep it separate from the internet as much as we can because we don't want unexpected things to happen. But unfortunately, this is one of them that we need internet connection. Based on rules and policies that are defined, VUM will then apply the updates to hosts and VMs. So basically, that's where we configure the baselines and choose what kind of things we want to update. Because it's not always needed to update everything, or not always our desired outcome to update everything. The installation of the updates can be scheduled. So obviously, for us, scheduling is in the lab itself. It's probably not convenient, but obviously, if something's running 24/7, then we know that there's some things sometimes which are better times to do it. For example, if you're a student or working at TAFE, we know most of our students work. TAFE is open from 9 a.m. to about 9 p.m. So if we're hosting lots of services that's running in those times, maybe that's a bad time to schedule a maintenance. But we also know that most people are not going to be asleep, are not going to be awake at 3 a.m. to about, 6 a.m., right? So maybe if we schedule some of these maintenance to happen at that time, it just means less disruption, less utilization is required at those points in time. So more VMs or more ESXi hosts can be updated, patched without too much disruption. So VUM has a one-to-one relationship, meaning one to vCenter. One vCenter will have one VUM. You can share jobs of downloading patches between different VUMs. So if you have multiple vCenters, for example, you can actually share the load of downloading those patches between multiple VUMs and with Update Manager download service. But reality is, why do we need it, right? All right, configuring the vSphere Update Manager. So let me just, all right. So if you look at this, so when we click on these 3 lines, so those 3 lines in the vSphere client, we can select a Lifecycle Update Manager. And that's where we are now here. So here we can actually put image depots. So that's for the embedded ESXi hosts where they don't have local storage. So we can just actually say, we're going to create a new image based on a new version. And we put it here. And then every time the ESXi boots, they'll receive this image or an updated image. We have the updates. So again, this is the entire ESXi updates that we are going to deploy. And obviously, this is the ISOs. They might be on a ESXi ISO. Remember, we used ISOs to create the virtual machines? Yep. So these updates might be based on these imported ISOs. But we're going to be working with baselines. Okay. Baselines, you can see there's some built-in ones. So you can see there's a few other ones I've made as part of this demonstration. But there's some built-in ones. There's host security patches. You can see that they're predefined. And then these are critical host patches. And there's non-critical host patches. These are built in, okay? Most of the time, you can just use these 3. No big deal, okay? Just use those 3. But obviously, to give you the experience of creating them, in our worksheet, we'll be creating a baseline that's got security patches. And we're going to call it this. We're going to call a baseline group, which could be 1 or more baselines grouped together. And then we're going to attach it. So from the updates tab, you can scan for. So from here, you can scan for. So you can scan for patches, create attach baseline, stage patches to hosts, and remediate hosts and guests. Clicking the Lifecycle Manager at the vSphere client homepage takes you to VUM administration, which is here. So baselines and groups. All right, so in order to keep ESX hosts and VMs updated, VUM uses baselines. Okay, that's what's called. It's basically just this definition of what should be included. VUM uses several different types of baselines. There's host baselines, which are designed for updating ESXi hosts, but there's also VM and VA baselines, which are for virtual machines and virtual appliances, which are designed for updating the virtual machines and appliances. Baselines are further subdivided into patch baselines or host, upgrade baselines or extension baselines. So patch baselines is what we're going to use because we're just applying the patches, whereas we can do the upgrade patch line baseline, which is basically to upgrade the whole version. Patch baselines define a list of patches to be applied to an ESXi host. So we say, hey, we need these patches, these patches, these patches. It can be very manual. We can say we don't want to follow the latest, very, very latest. We just want to make sure that it has these critical ones. Or we can actually just use what's built in there, and basically they always check for the latest and apply the latest security, latest critical, and so forth. Upgrade baselines defines how to upgrade an ESXi host, the virtual machine's virtual hardware, VMware tools, or the virtual appliance. There's no other type of baselines for hosts. Host extension baselines are used for managing extensions installed onto ESXi hosts. Patch baselines are divided into, again, 2 types. There's a dynamic, which is basically constantly checking what is the latest. And there's fixed baselines, which is basically you saying, hey, I want these ones and only these ones onto my host. They remain constant. But the dynamic ones is always getting the latest ones and applying to the things, which is probably the one we should be using. Okay, the one we should be using is probably the dynamic, because these days, as we know very well, staying up to date and updating all your operating systems, including your ESXi, is critical for security. So VMware provides a few baselines with VUM when it's installed. The baselines are present upon installation. The two dynamic ones are critical host patch baselines and non-critical, and there's a security one as well. And a dynamic baseline also is there for updating VMware tools, and obviously that checks for the latest ones. And a dynamic baseline for upgrading virtual machine hardware. Again, that's staying up to date. And a dynamic one for your virtual appliances. But the host ones is what we're focused on today. So if we look at this, the patch criteria, remember I said that you can select what patches it looks for. Okay, for this one, it's a patch baseline. We're going to say automatically update this baseline with the patches. So this is dynamic because it's automatically updating. And we can choose from anywhere, but in this demonstration, we've chosen VMware. So that's the people who publish the update. And we're going to, in the product, we're going to look at any of these versions. And we could have gone for any, we could have gone for important, we could have gone for moderate, but we chose critical because that's the one we wanted to focus on today. And we're not going to focus on enhancements or bug fixes. We're going to focus on security patches, as you know, which is the important one, right? So again, we can actually make this so that it checks for baselines after a certain date and before another certain date. But to be honest, if you configure this, it won't look for anything after a certain date. So we want to make sure it's dynamic, is always checking for the latest, so we leave this alone. So there's other things as well. There's a list of VUM specific events. So there's a log for that. Notifications displays any notifications about patch recalls or patch fixes. You know, what does that mean? That means like just because there's a patch doesn't mean there's no problems in the patch. Yeah, so there's sometimes the patch causes more problems than the original problem it's trying to fix. So basically these are notifications where VMware has recalled them or give you warning. There's also a patch repository, which shows all the patches that are currently on your patch repository, ESXi images, where you will upload files for upgrading ESXi. So basically, if we find that picture, basically the image depot, the imported ISOs and so forth, okay? So talking about that. Routine updates. So like we know, updating should be part of your ordinary practice, okay? So remediation is the process of applying a patch or upgrade to a vSphere object. So that's what it means, fix. Remediation means fix, okay? VUM uses the baselines to create a list of patches based on what criteria you've chosen. By attaching the baseline to an object, which in our case is a host, and we can perform a scan, and this checks if that object, which is the host in our case, is compliant or non-compliant with what's required in the baseline. Compliance with the baseline means that the host or VM has all the patches including that baseline. Non-compliance means it's missing one or more patches, which is what you expect, right? So after compliance is determined, so after you scan it, the administrator can remediate. So I can say remediate, which is what we'll do. Optionally, the administrator can also stage patches before remediation. So staging is almost like stop wasting, don't waste time, let the ESXi run. Staging means if I've got like 100 megs to download, I'll download 100 megs to the ESXi temporarily. And then when it's all ready to go, then remediate. So staging is almost like that getting ready period. It's just like us. If we want to go to Melbourne and you're going to drive your car, I'm going to drive my car, we might say, hey, let's meet up on the corner of Port Rush Road and Glen Osmond Road, that petrol station. And you make sure you pack your car and I'll pack my car and we'll meet there. And when we're all ready to go, we go. So it's like staging is that getting ready. Okay. Okay. So first, you must create and attach a baseline. So basically, you need to have a baseline. You need to attach it to the objects. A scan will determine if it's compliant or not to the baseline. If the object scan matches what's defined in the baseline, it is compliant. If something is missing, then it's non-compliant. Okay, that's pretty obvious. While the process of scanning different objects is essentially the same, with some differences. So scanning VMs, they're only scanning for the VMware tools and the virtual hardware. When you scan a virtual appliance, you're just seeing if there's a newer version of it. So for example, our vCenter is a virtual appliance, isn't it? So it's just checking if there's a newer one. But more importantly, for us, for the assignment one, for us, scanning the ESXi or ESX and ESXi hosts, the host will need to be online. Each of the hosts, obviously, you can't scan them if they're not online, and they need to be reachable. And we're scanning for patches, for any extensions or any upgrades, depending on what we put in the baseline. So like I said, staging, if a target is a ESXi host, so the ESXi host, like I said, if we update it, if we say we remediate, and then we download the 400 megs of updates, right? Then it means that all that time for downloading it as well as remediating it means the virtual machines can't run it. So there's a big disruption. So basically, by staging it, the ESXi still can be used until it's ready. And then it's a shorter process for remediation after that, okay? Staging a patch on the ESXi host copies the files across to the host and speeds up the actual time for the remediation. Okay, so the whole point is to make sure that it's not down for any longer than it needs. Staging is not required. You can definitely you don't have to do that. You can update the host without staging first if you prefer, but it's just going to take longer. Okay, so it's not a big deal. It is a big deal if you have a very critical amount of hosts and you can't afford too much downtime, especially if you barely have enough hosts to virtualize all the VMs you have, okay? So VUM won't stage patches for any PXC booted ESXi hosts. Of course not, because PXC means network booting, right? Pre-execution environment booting. What does that mean? That means it's going to download an image from somewhere and boot from it. So again, that's this image depot. So instead of actually patching the host and installing the updates, we just make a new image and tell it to reboot, and it will download the new image. It will already be updated. So that's why it won't do that. So staging host patches is particularly useful when hosts are spread across a slow WAN link. Yeah, that's kind of bad. So if you have a vCenter and VUM, which is on a slow link to the ESXi host, then obviously staging is very important, because then you don't want to waste all that time downloading a big amount of data through a slow link. But that's not really that, relevant these days. Most times they're going to be very, on a fast link between the host and the VUM, just in case. Hosts do not need to be in maintenance mode while they're staging, but they only need to go into maintenance mode when they're remediating. What does that mean? Maintenance mode is when they can't host VMs. Okay, so that's why that's important there. Staging patches also allows the upload to be scheduled for time of heavy, for when heavy WAN utilization is appropriate. So basically, if I'm got all this, everything's so busy, this is not a good time. So we can actually stage the patches when it's not less busy. There's so VUM. There's also vSphere takes advantage of Microsoft PowerShell scripting environment with the PowerCLI. PowerCLI tools are available for scripting many of VUM's functions, and the VUM PowerCLI commandlets does most of the common tasks, like working with baseline scanning and staging and remediating. So potentially we could do all this remotely through a PowerCLI and configure this. What about if you don't have VUM? Okay, so remember what if we don't have VUM at all? What if we just have a ESXi host and we're just using individual hosts, okay? So you can maintain your vSphere environment, keeping elements patched and upgraded without resorting to VUM. Because what if you don't want VUM? What if you just don't have vCenter? What if you still want to stay up to date? So for example, you could be using a free standalone ESXi, which does not come with vCenter. It's free. That's very nice. But obviously, hopefully you know that ESXi with a standalone does not have many of the good features, such as vMotion, DRS, and all those kind of stuff for clustering. But it's free, okay? But essentially, ESXi standalone is like your VMware workstation, but as a bare metal virtualization tool. It does nothing more than your VMware workstation. Okay, so none of those clustering, load balancing, and all those kind of things. Okay, so that's for very, very small environments with 1 or 2 hosts. Not very likely in modern life, but obviously depending on the size of your company as well. You could have a small company who just wants to save money, virtualize all their servers, and not pay for full vSphere. So and they don't want the infrastructure overheads. You rely heavily on scripting to manage your environment, and you would like to take advantage of the tools that don't need PowerShell, or these are all reasons why. Okay, you don't want to use VUM for host upgrades because you choose always to run a fresh rebuild. Okay, that's fine as well. You can always create a new host, can't you? Yep. You already have a kickstart. These other reasons. You already have a kickstart script, PowerShell post-install scripts, host profile or EDA or UDA tools that you want to set up to auto-deploy servers to control the installation and upgrading of your host. So instead of using VUM, you're using something else basically. So upgrading or patching hosts, you can just run an interactive install from a new ISO or a media. Okay. In place upgrade. You can use a kickstart script. So basically, if you don't know kickstart, that's a Linux version of an auto installation script. Okay, to upgrade along the same ESXi media to perform the unintended installation. So this one and this one exactly the same, except for this one requires you to be there, press the buttons and stuff like that. This one basically all done for you. A VMware auto deploy technology that we can roll out vSphere 5 or later, then you'll be able to leverage this tool to upgrade or patch it to the latest updates. ESXi 5 or later can also be patched and upgraded with the command line interface, the ESX CLI tool. What about VMs? Upgrading VM hardware can only be done via the vSphere client, so FreeI interface. If the hosts are connected to vCenter, then you can connect and manually upgrade each one. If you don't want to use VUM, that is, okay. You must shut down the VMs itself, so that's annoying. But unfortunately, sometimes there must be downtime, as you know, with any upgrades or patches. Without vCenter, you can still upgrade each VMs by connecting your client straight to the host. So instead of managing each host through the vCenter, you just go directly to the host that we know about. VMware tools can be upgraded in each of the guest operating systems manually, just by you choosing to upgrade the VMware tools, just like in VMware Workstation. But you must mount the VMware tools ISO onto the guest operating system, and it will become like ISO, and you just update it. All right, so that's the end of our presentation. So right now, what I would like you to do is work on your labs or your assignment.